Hello, GHT squad, and welcome back to another episode of The Gut Honest Truth. The Gut Honest Truth is a functional medicine practice based in Kensington, Maryland, that is right outside of the Washington, D.C. area. And for anyone who is new to us, I am your host, Katie Morra. I am both a registered dietitian as well as a functional medicine practitioner certified through the Institute for Functional Medicine. I treat a wide range of conditions, but I do specialize in gut health, especially IBS. So if you have it, I probably treat it. Now, we're going to jump right into today's episode, and I have a very special guest, somebody I've been very excited to have on since this podcast started years ago, and that is Dr. Carrie Jones. So I'm going to give you a little introduction and let you tell me all about yourself, because I'm sure you have way more interesting stuff to say than your bio. So Carrie Jones is a naturopathic physician and board certified in endocrinology with a master's in public health. She has over 15 years of experience in functional and integrative medicine. She is also currently the medical director for Precision Analytical, who is the creator for the most cutting-edge hormone test on the market, the Dutch test, which we use at Gut Honest Truth. So Carrie, welcome, and please tell me more about you and how you got into functional medicine, endocrinology. Yes.
All the things. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Now that I've figured out my audiovisual equipment, I'm super glad to be here. Little tech issues today on my end. But I have been interested in medicine since I was a little kid. I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician and maybe an OBGYN. Went into undergrad thinking I was going to become an MD, the more conventional route, only I was volunteering at 2 different hospitals and realized the conventional route is not for me. And I moved to Portland, Oregon on a whim, found naturopathic medicine, realized that was my calling, and did women's health and hormones through pretty much my whole education, my residency and practice. And now I get to work with thousands and thousands of hormone tests at the Dutch test, which is really a lot of fun.
So I would love, most of my followers and subscribers probably have heard me talk about the Dutch test. I've tried to talk about it somewhat in detail, even though we probably haven't had like a whole episode on it. So if you can introduce us a little bit more specifically to the Dutch test, I think that would be really helpful for the rest of the conversation going forward.
It is an acronym. So we do get asked, does it test for Dutch heritage? No, it stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones. So it is a urine test, but it's not something that you have to like pee in a bucket and collect. Thankfully, it's these pieces of filter paper that you will urinate on in the morning, then a new one 2 hours later, then a new one around dinner, then a new one around bed. And then if you wake up in the middle of the night, let all the strips dry, mail them back to the lab. And what we do is we give you basically a pretty comprehensive overlook at your hormones, your estrogens, how your estrogens go through detox, your progesterone, your testosterone, your DHEAS, how those get sort of moved through the body, because we have different pathways for those, melatonin, your cortisol through the day, and plus some other really cool nutritional markers. And so really we just sort of focus on like our adrenal, so our cortisol, and our male and female sort of sex hormone health when you do a Dutch test.
I love the Dutch test. I use it myself and on any client I can get to, but I really do love, like, once you do the test with a provider and you go through it, if they share the whole result with you, it's fascinating, right? It's like, I don't even know how many pages, like 8+ pages of dials and crazy just sites. So it's one of those tests you really need a provider to go through, evaluate for you to come up with a specific treatment plan for you. But I mostly love that it does differentiate the types of estrogens, and it differentiates how things move through the body versus just sort of that snapshot of blood work that doesn't differentiate those things. So
and I get asked that. Women will say in particular, can't I just go get my blood drawn? Can't I just go check estradiol? Like, absolutely, you totally can. But just like you said, I can't tell you where it's moving. Mm-hmm. And as you know, and as you talk about, like, some of the pathways are better than others. And so, like if you're experiencing PMS or tender breasts or heavy periods, fibroids, endometriosis, breast cancer, we're trying to mitigate that. And by understanding these pathways, that can be the real insight. Like, that can be the real, like, aha moment. Mm-hmm. This is why I'm feeling like I'm feeling, and let's do stuff to help.
Yeah, it's definitely been a great tool and game changer in my personal practice, which sort of leads us into today's hot topic, which I know is like, I think it's your jam right now. And it is a buzzword, especially in the functional medicine and hormone community, but the estrobolome, right? So
yes.
This is going to be, I'm excited about this because it's actually like the perfect blend of our two specialties, right? We have hormone health and gut health coming together. Obviously, those two interact in many other ways, but this is going to be a big talk on how much does gut and lifestyle affect your hormones and vice versa. So for this, I'm sure you've seen me tag you a million times, but I love your analogy on estrogen detox. So not to make you do it for the millionth time, but we do that for our followers is go through your bathtub, Carrie Jones analogy of how estrogen is moving and what those kind of brief picture of that, because the phases are going to matter for this conversation.
Absolutely. When it comes to estrogen detox, primarily we talk about it as it's a 3-phase process. And so when you're on estrogen in your body, and your body's done with that estrogen and it needs to get detoxified. It's the same thing as metabolized, cleared out, however you want to say it. And so what I use is my infamous bathtub analogy. So it's got to be clawfoot, of course, because I'm extra and I don't have a clawfoot bathtub, but I really want a clawfoot bathtub. So think of a clawfoot bathtub, and the water coming into your bathtub, you can never turn off, but you can adjust. And that's your phase 1. The ability of your drain out of your bathtub is phase 2. And then your sewer line that moves all the crap, literally junk, dirty water out of the house, either into your septic or into the city line, that's your phase 3. And so if you're an estrogen and you go through phase 1, it predominantly happens in the liver, not always, but often. And this is where your estrogen, unfortunately, has to get converted into another form of estrogen. We call it a metabolite. And this metabolite's often more toxic. It's more toxic than the original estrogen. So then the body's like, wow, this is really toxic. Some are more toxic than others, which is where it relates to things like breast cancer or heavier periods or fibroids or things like that. So then we move into step 2. The body hopefully rushes it along to step 2, which is where we neutralize the estrogen. And when it's neutral, this is great, right? It's then water soluble, so you can safely excrete it either through your kidneys or through your intestines. And then phase 3 is quite literally where you get rid of it out of the sewer line. So most of the time, you are going to poop it out. And that's where we talk about the estrobolome. But what's so interesting is when you were talking about this detox and go back to the bathtub, if the type of water coming into your bathtub is too fast or too slow or wrong, if your drain is clogged and not able to get the water out, or if your sewer line is broken, all of these are going to affect, like your bathroom, your house, your bathtub, and it's going to cause overflow. It's the same in your body. If any of these systems aren't working, you're going to have hormone disbalance or estrogen, sort of overload, so to speak. But I teach it as 1, 2, 3. So everyone thinks, oh, we adjust the water and then we open the drain and then we work on the sewer line. It's the same in your house, though. If you're looking at your bathtub and your bathtub is starting to overflow, but you can't turn off the water, then you have to first check, like, oh my gosh, is it the sewer line that's broken? Is the drain even open? And this is where it's mind blowing, because I'm like, look, when we go for treatment, we start with the sewer line. We start with phase 3. We start with the gut.
Yeah.
And then we move up to phase 2, and then we move up to phase 1. Always make sure that sewer line is open.
Yeah, it's definitely where I know a lot of people have their own methodologies of practice, but as somebody who, of course, when I'm certified in functional medicine, I have extensive training in every category of kind of interactions in the body, but I specialize in gut health. And when I do that, I almost always start with, if they can afford it, stool and or SIBO testing together, because I want to make sure, right, if your gut isn't functioning properly, you have parasites or whatever that's giving you symptoms, and symptoms can be estrogen dominance, right? If that is going on for somebody and you're not absorbing well, like the rest of it doesn't totally matter at this point, because we need to get that cleared out and situated before you can absorb the 20 other supplements someone might throw at you to try to correct something else. So
even the one of the most common supplements for estrogen that people just get handed all the time, kind of like Oprah gives out cars, is DIM, right? Diindolylmethane. Lots and lots of women and men are like, oh, you have an estrogen problem. It's the end all be all solver for DIM, or they'll be told, okay, eat the brassica family, broccoli, kale, cauliflower, or eat the master metabolite, which is called indole 3-carbinol. Well, the interesting part is you have to have healthy gut, stomach acid to break it down in the first place. So if you're eating all this broccoli and you're eating all these Brussels sprouts and you're taking indole 3-carbinol, but you don't have healthy stomach acid, which is part of your gut, Like, it doesn't matter. You're not going to break it down to get that dim in the first place. And so it all goes back to the gut anyhow.
Yeah. That makes me so everyone that listens to this knows I always come back to saying I'm like the queen of stomach acid complaining and saying that it's the issue, but I'm like stress and chronic low stomach acid, always like the founder and gut problem of everything. You need to fix it, correct it, and strengthen it through whatever means to kind of get there. But it does always come back to the gut. And I remember actually having a call with you when I worked elsewhere years ago, and you were like, actually, I'd always start with the gut. And I was like, see, this is where, also a company and an individual, like, good, right? They're not just pushing something they have, they're really looking out for the individual and being like, if I had to choose, I would start with making sure someone's gut.
The Dutch test only looks at the phase 1 and 2. We only look at the water in the drain, and that's it, because we are a urine test. We are not a stool test. And so absolutely. I've like practitioners like yourself. I have people, practitioners reach out to me on social media and say, my patient has a lot of constipation or, gas or bloating or indigestion or what have you. And they have all these hormonal complaints, PMS and, breast tenderness and heavy periods and, fertility problems. Should I do the Dutch test? I'm like, no, I mean, sure, but no. But no, we just start with the gut.
Yeah, if you can do both, it's nice.
Yeah, if you can, from a financial point of view, if he or she wants to do both, go for it. But if you wanted to sort of choose one in a stepwise pattern, in that instance, go with the gut. Open up the sewer line first.
Exactly. And I have to just say, this is just like my fangirl moment, but the reason I love following you and talking to you is because, well, it takes like a lot for me to like really be impressed with a human being. But when you can take very complicated information, especially in the medical world, and make it so dumbed down into layman's terms, but interesting at the same time for people. I love it because if anyone is not following Dr. Carrie Jones, you need to do so on social media because she explains so much in such an easy to digest, pun intended, way. And I try to do that with gut health because it's very complicated, and it doesn't matter if you're the smartest, most intellectual individual in a room. If you cannot make the rest of the room understand it, it doesn't matter. So I just wanted to tell you that because
oh my God,
you do
you're the sweetest.
an amazing job at it. And you do it with humor, which is obviously, if anyone knows Gut Honest Truths, the whole tagline is all about like sarcasm and wit. So we appreciate you. Right?
I love it.
Yes. So
I joke to my friends tease me. They're like, you have the sense of humor of it like a 16-year-old. I'm like, I know. It's what makes life fun.
I know. You're like, you should work on that. But so here we are. We're talking about the estrobolome. So fancy word. It's not as complicated as it probably sounds. I've told people the word and they're like, what?
It's my favorite word in science. And in Spanish, it's estroboloma, which sounds sexy to me.
Yeah, estroboloma. We're gonna just call it that for the rest of the podcast. But why don't you inform us what the estroboloma is all about? What is that?
Thankfully, it is the estrogen part of your microbiome squished together. So they just took both words and made it the estrobolome, or estroboloma, if we're
going that route.
We're going that. I was lecturing in Mexico, and they taught me that in Mexico because they thought it was really amazing. So you have a part of your microbiome that handles hormone regulation, so to speak. And so all of the hormones, not just estrogen, but we talk about estrogen kind of the most often. And so you have this nifty little enzyme. It's called beta glucuronidase. And again, as we always talk about functional and medical anatomy, physiology, I don't know who names these things. I wish they would get named like nail polish. It would make it so much easier to remember. But anyway, this enzyme is beta glucuronidase. And what it does is it takes estrogen that is basically in a box with a bow, tagged to get shipped out of your body, literally dumped into the toilet, and it opens the box, it unties the bow, and it lets estrogen fly free so you can get reabsorbed. So if your beta glucuronidase is too elevated, this enzyme is too elevated in this part of your microbiome, then poof, you have higher levels of estrogen than you want circulating around your body, all because of the gut. And so by understanding your gut health, by understanding if you have bugs or parasites or, inflammation is a huge factor. Constipation is a huge factor. These all affect estrogen. And so when I have men and women that say, gosh, I have all the estrogen symptoms. Do you think it's for maybe women, think it's my ovaries? Do you think it's this? Do you think it's that? I'm like, it could actually be your intestinal tract. It's hard to believe, but if the intestines are mismanaging estrogen, then they're just going to get pulled back in and pushed out into circulation.
Yeah. And that's, and it can be both, right? It could be,
100%.
which is, I think, also overlooked
Yeah.
a little bit as even as providers, like it can be the gut, but it also can be coming from the actual, like the ovaries, for example, for what you just said. And it's like both of those. That's why the testing, big supporter of like testing and not guessing, right? Because then you
Absolutely.
see that and
Absolutely.
can address it specifically.
I was just doing research into toxins, right? Xenoestrogens, which are basically chemicals in the world that act like estrogen, and I was looking into their, of course, routes of excretion and elimination, and because I've been doing a lot about estrogen detox, and I wanted to see if, a plastic, a phthalate, a paraben, do they get excreted the same way? They get excreted a little bit differently in the beginning, but they do all end up either in your sweat, they end up in your urine, and they do end up in your stool. So once again, if you think you're just clearing out those, like you drink out of a plastic water bottle
Mhm.
and you pick up all the plastics in there and you think not a problem, it's just going to go through my gut and I'm going to excrete it. But if your microbiome is imbalanced, then this toxin can just get pulled right back in as well. So it
Yeah.
even applies to the estrogen-like chemicals and not just estrogen itself.
And that we at Gut Honest Truth, we have a couple different programs we put out that are really inexpensive just to try to get people's like lifestyle a little in check. So we have like a DIY program that's detoxing your body and lifestyle. And it's all about that, right? Like a diet sort of to support the gut health and excretion, but it also goes into the science and the research beside where all the chemicals and the toxins coming from, right? And how to best improve that. Because it really does come down to lifestyle, unless you are someone, of course, who is just the toxic burden is so high that you really, really need that detox support through supplement, medication, IVs, whatever,
Right.
in
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
situation. So what other, you know, things outside of course, gut infections are huge. And we just talked about the toxins and the environment. What else will increase that beta glucuronidase and cause an unhealthy gut to increase
Dietary choices.
Yes. No one likes to hear
Diet. No one likes to hear about dietary choices. It's funny when I lecture, and I'm sure you do too, or you'll get this response. Is I'll say to people, to a crowd, like for a lot of people, what food you shouldn't be eating. Like if you shouldn't be eating ice cream, or if cheese is a bother. Like if whenever you eat whatever, something takeout, whatever it is, like it upsets your stomach every time, but you don't care because it tastes so good. And I'm like, look, every time you're doing that, every single time you are causing inflammation, which is affecting the lining of your gut and your microbiome. And that's going to affect not only things like your immune system and your brain health, but it's also going to affect your hormone health as well. And so everything from what foods you do choose to eat, all the way down to how you process those foods. Do you chew your food or do you inhale your food? What do you do, right? Like, just we talked earlier, do you have enough stomach acid in the first place to really begin to break these proteins and these carbs and fats apart so that you can, move through in a healthy manner? And so I really encourage people to determine, to pay attention to their body, to the listen to their body. They know, usually at least on a few key things, like people know what upsets their stomach and they still choose to eat it.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, most of my listeners, at least I hope, but people who take a great interest in functional medicine usually have pretty clean diets. So sometimes it's not usually what brings people to me as a diet. It's just not. It's they've seen 8 doctors, they've gotten nowhere, they need to get help. But that crappy sad American diet that's low in fiber, high in alcohol, high in stress, high in sugar, like no nutrient dense foods. So if that is you, or that's even you like half of the week.
Right, which is true. Why people are like, I'm good all week, and then it's the weekend. It's the freaking weekend. So I absolutely let loose. And man, there's just thankfully in the research, it shows the microbiome can shift in about 24 hours. And so if you do decide to, play it up on Friday, by Saturday, you have a different microbiome. But if you, sort of get back on the wagon by Sunday, Monday, hopefully you're headed back in the right direction. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're doomed lifelong, but it does mean you have to make changes and keep said changes to help.
And it's so funny. I notice, just because usually my patients are so much more advanced in their knowledge as well as their treatments, you always overlook like the most basic things that it all comes back down to, of like, are you eating when you're stressed out? Are you chewing well enough? Are you hydrated enough? And I'm like, I probably should have asked that 3 appointments ago. But it's so true, right? Because if you're not going to produce the digestive juices and the stomach acid and everything you need, if you're eating under stress, or if you're B, not chewing well enough, it does not trigger downstream everything.
Right.
So such
And
simple
even
things you could focus on.
now with work from home, so even the people, even my friends and colleagues, myself included, I'm totally just as guilty sometimes. Like we eat clean diets, but now that it's all work from home all the time for a lot of us, we're like, I'm eating in front of the computer. Like, whereas before I would either, get lunch, go to lunch, have lunch, I would take a break for lunch. And now it just all seems to blend together. The boundaries initially were really blurred. And so remembering to go get water and remembering like, oh, I shouldn't be working and stressed out while trying to eat this lunch so I can, just stay productive all day makes a huge difference to get off my computer, go somewhere else, sit down, relax, chew my food. It's like, oh, right. Basic physiology. Okay.
Normalcy is bad. It's been a year. We'll all get there. But I agree with you. The boundaries are just not there for anyone. And it's hard, and people are working harder than ever, honestly.
Yes.
Most
Burnout
people.
is real. Burnout is
Yeah,
real.
burnout is very real. So you already alluded to a lot of this, but I want to take a minute to focus, because people are like, well, how do I know I have estrogen dominance outside of testing, of course, or what are some signs? So a bunch of the symptoms, and especially certain conditions that people might not be realizing, because traditional providers probably aren't like, hey, you have endometriosis, maybe you should go get your gut checked, So
Right.
what are some of those conditions that listeners might be listening to that suspect they might have hormonal imbalances, that this might fit for them?
Absolutely. So endometriosis is definitely one of them. While estrogen is likely not the originating root cause of endometriosis, if estrogen's out of control or sort of on all the time, then it can make endometriosis worse. Fibroid growth and development we don't really know where fibroids come from, but we do know that they can be perpetuated and made to grow from estrogen. PMS is a big one. So that premenstrual syndrome, we've got the tender breast, the moodiness, the heavy periods, the clots, trying to think of like the mood swings, right? That all that fun stuff that goes along with it, can occur with estrogen. Now, believe it or not, estrogen can really affect mental health. Estrogen can affect serotonin and dopamine in our brain. And so we often correlate it, like I said, with PMS, but it can be more than just that, a couple days before your period, especially if depression, anxiety, addiction, estrogen could be one of the additions that go along with it. And then we oftentimes, because of estrogen, we will see estrogen maybe out of balance with progesterone, start to think like maybe fertility issues, right? And so because we need that progesterone in balance with that estrogen for everything, but also when you're trying to get pregnant. And these same things also apply to men. Men, when they develop the belly fat, men will also more depression, less motivation. So it's a lot of the low testosterone symptoms, but actually they're converting their testosterone into estrogen.
Posted about that today.
What'd you say?
Posted all about that today.
Oh, did you? See, I haven't been on Instagram as much today, so have to look at that.
Men out there.
Absolutely. And then with women, think like breast cancer, right? Because estrogen is estrogen gone wrong. Estrogen going down the wrong pathway is indicated in breast cancers and uterine cancers. It's been indicated as a risk for even things like cervical or vulvar cancer. It can potentially perpetuate viruses in that area, like HPV, which can then cervical cancer can be, or even vaginal or vulvar cancer can be indicated there. And so estrogen can really cause a lot of issues. Estrogen's really related to our immune system, believe it or not. There are a number of autoimmune conditions that do better in an estrogenic state, and and others that do worse in an estrogenic state. So you'll hear of some autoimmune, like MS is a good example. MS seems to come on later as women are getting closer to perimenopause and maybe losing some of that estrogen, as opposed to younger other conditions where estrogen is higher, obviously because we're younger and we're cycling, then it can actually flare autoimmune. And it's all because it's tied the way that it's tied to our immune system. So estrogen is like Goldilocks. It needs to be, kind of the right amount depending where she is in her cycle. Otherwise it can really cause some issues. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So a big thing that as I said, I'm big on test, don't guess, because, well, there's a million reasons, but people really mess themselves up, right? So you think keep in mind that a lot of hormonal imbalances, just like a lot of gut conditions, right? Like infections in the gut have very similar symptoms to, or can have very similar symptoms. So if you believe you're estrogen dominant, don't just go on the internet and find DIM, like you said before, or, sulforaphane or something and start taking it, because in a state, let's just say somebody who, I'm making this up as I go here, but somebody who's becoming perimenopausal and their progesterone might be starting to drop, their estrogen starting to drop, but they're probably still estrogen dominant just due to the two kind of competing with each other there. But for someone like that, where their estrogen, right, it's not going to be too high. That's not going to be the problem very likely for that individual. And they start taking DIM because they heard that it's good for their estrogen dominant symptoms. What's going to happen to that individual's body?
Unfortunately, because DIM pulls estrogen out of circulation, their estrogen will then drop. So what would happen, and I even have it happening in, I've had women in their 20s tell me that they went on DIM, they read about it, and now they're having hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal dryness, feeling depressed, because DIM really does drop estrogen levels. And so be careful if you're menopausal, be careful if you drop it too low, don't just go on it because you read a blog or heard a podcast that it helps estrogen. It does, but in specific men and women for specific reasons.
You can really do yourself a disservice. Something like sulforaphane is a little bit more benign, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, just because it's going to push it down a better pathway versus lower it in the bloodstream.
Right.
So that's always a little bit better. And you don't, right, you don't want to just be taking supplements to take supplements either. More is not better. That's another thing. I feel like when people come to me, they have the list of like 20 already that they just like write about. I'm like, oh my gosh,
I know. And then they spend all that money on it, and so by the time they come to see us, sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're like, oh, I don't know if I can afford testing. Like, well, if you hadn't bought 20 supplements that don't work.
My thing lately, I'm like, if you have the money to buy every supplement you found on like the internet from researching or following all of us, like you would have the money to do the test to see if you even need supplements, right? Maybe it isn't that problem, or maybe it's not the problem you quite think. So I really do encourage people to get tested with whatever means, start with the blood test if you need to, just to get a big snapshot. But if you can find a provider or work with Dutch or something, because you guys also provide testing, I believe, to people that
we do. Yeah, we do, but we don't recommend it. We do because we're a lab, but we don't recommend it because we don't do any interpretation at all. And so men and women order it and then they call and they go, oh my gosh, I don't know what this means. It's pages of information that looks foreign to me. What does this mean? I'm like, let's connect you with a provider in your area.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah. So I am accepting new patients.
So go see Katie.
You should have this looked at, but that it is a very, very overwhelming test. Even like I know endless providers that look at it like, I don't know what any of this means because it's so detailed. It's amazing. But I do want to just reiterate, like if you leave something untreated, right, like elevated beta glucuronidase, especially at super high amounts. I believe there's research connected to colon cancer, even with
I think so too.
Yeah. So it's like a lot of cancers were thrown out there. That does not mean you will get develop cancer, but it's something to be, notice. Like, do I test this? Do I rule this out? I recommend a stool test if you can afford it once a year, just to make sure everything's in check, more so preventatively than treatment for many people who are optimizing wellness. But you also want to just make sure, okay, is that the right thing? Am I taking the right supplements and what have you? And there's also, I believe I found research. There's a lot of research on lactobacillus and the estrobolome, isn't there? Especially
yeah, actually, there's several of them. I mean, some of the bifidos, and there are a number of bacteria that are capable of producing beta glucuronidase, the enzyme. And so, but again, it's sort of all about balance, and it's sort of all about the person. It doesn't mean if you. So I have had people say, "Oh, I'm going to take a lactobacillus probiotic," and that or I'm not going to. I apologize. I'm not going to. I'm going to stop my probiotic because I don't want to increase my beta glucuronidase. I'm like, well, actually, what we need to do is clean up your gut, clean up your, increase your fiber, get you off the alcohol. Let's talk about antibiotic use. Let's reduce toxins. Like all the things. Let's reduce inflammation as we're going, and then it's not your probiotic. I'm sorry to tell you.
Yeah.
It's not your probiotic. That's the problem.
There's another big buzzword in especially the gut health field of dysbiosis being thrown out. And sometimes I think it's being thrown out inappropriately and people don't totally, it's such a basic concept, but people still aren't using it correctly. But all it is, right, is imbalance of good and bad bacteria. So these are a lot of things that people will see on a stool test for you. Though also that's where you'll find the elevated or normal beta glucuronidase level. So a comprehensive stool test is where we're talking about really starting. But that dysbiotic flora, right? So it could be in the situation like we're talking about, lactobacillus, a good bacteria being low, and then you could have like Pseudomonas and Morganella being high, which are going to be more pathogenic or bad guys. So it's not so much, oh, this bacteria shouldn't be there. It's what are the levels? Why are they imbalanced? And how do we reset that? Because people always feel comforted even, once we do a test and they're like, oh man, all my estrogen's like recirculating. But I'm like, if this major cause is just this dysbiotic flora and we can correct that balance, like naturally that beta glucuronidase is going to come into normal limits.
Right.
And if it's really high, I'm going to support you with something called calcium deglucarate. So with that, I know you recommend it. Is that something you find relatively benign for people?
I do. The only people I don't, and this is a very small percentage, are those who for some reason can't take or shouldn't take or been advised to not take calcium. Because it is calcium deglucarate. It's not the same as taking a calcium supplement, but there is a small percent of calcium in there. So I have had on the rare occasion somebody say, for whatever reason, I can't take calcium. Like, all right, you can't do that one. But for everybody else, I find that calcium deglucarate is relatively benign at keeping. It keeps the estrogen in that box that we talked about earlier. Keeps it in the box with the lid on, with the bow on, so that you can excrete it out into the toilet. And I also like to remind people that we don't want our beta glucuronidase at 0. It's actually a very helpful enzyme, but much like Goldilocks, it can't be too low and it can't be too high. I mean, it does help us absorb some of our flavonoids. It does help us break down some of our large carbohydrates. And so we do need some of it. It helps us recycle bilirubin. But for the estrogen portion of it, we don't want to squash it. We just want it back into a healthy range, and we want healthy gut function.
And what do you think of if, say, I ran a stool test on you and your beta glucuronidase was like very low? Sometimes I believe it'll even say like below detected limits. What do you think about or get concerned about with that?
So usually then I'm thinking about like, what is going on? What is going on with my microbiome that I'm not able to produce it in the first place? And even I start to think about even just large intestine health. So butyrate and my short chain fatty acids and things like that, is to like, why can't I even make it in the first place? And now I'm concerned about flavonoids, and I'm concerned about bilirubin, and I'm concerned about, carbohydrate breakdown and things like that.
And the whole concept of the beta glucuronidase being elevated, the butyrate being low, all these different things is a big problem when it comes to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth as well. Specifically, the people who are treating themselves or with a provider that isn't very skilled in treating SIBO, and they're putting them on the low FODMAP diet very long term, right? I have people that have been on it for like 5 years, and that's restricting all these healthy fibers that are going to help give them some of the butyrate production and short chain fatty acids they also need, as well as a diverse microbiome, right? So we have people that struggle with that, and then due to the SIBO, they're going to have elevated beta glucuronidase. So it gets very complicated, right? And that's also why I like to usually pair SIBO testing with stool testing to see the entire picture, because I really do believe I would always opt for a stool test prior, because I do think there's more research there, the testing's better, all of that. But if you're not getting both, it's like seeing half the picture. You just can't get a complete picture. So that's my biased opinion.
But it works, right? It works for your patients, and when they get better, you're like, see,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, testing, there's so much to still be improved upon as a whole, but like, what are some of the ways you advise when you speak to people in conferences, if you talk to people at all, like the Dutch employees, on how to help people improve their microbiome for healthy estrogen?
So okay. So first of all, it's like we talked earlier, what do you put in your mouth, right? So you set like the standard American diet, that's, high sugar, high crap, low biodiversity, low colors, low fiber, like all of that will 100% affect gut health. And so if that's the type of diet that you're eating, then we talk about that first. Constipation is huge. The more that your stool sits there, then the more opportunity your toxins, your estrogen, your hormones have to get pulled out of the stool and pulled back into circulation. And so to the people who say, well, I have a bowel movement every other day, every couple of days, or when I have it, it's, like rabbit pellets, it's not a lot. then you have a constipation issue. So what's going on? And let's get your GI tract moving, because at the very least, you probably feel bloated and blah, and we want to get those hormones out, right? And so I'm also a big fan of things like prebiotics. I do like inulin, I like jicama, I like Jerusalem artichoke. I haven't done things like green banana flour, but I know that, I have other colleagues who love the resistant starches.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do a lot of resistant starches?
I don't fixate on it as much as I probably could. But I feel like a lot of people that come to me end up coming because they have SIBO, and so they don't tolerate any of it.
No, they're not going to tolerate any of that.
Not initially, at least.
Yeah. But if they can. So it's funny. I was lecturing actually at that conference in Mexico, in Guadalajara, and they had carrots, celery, and jicama out on a plate. And I was lecturing, and I was being translated. So I was lecturing in English, but everyone had a headset on. They were translating. And I said, talking about prebiotics, and I said, jicama. I said, it's the white sticks out there next to the carrots, and nobody would eat it. So every break, right, all the carrots were gone, all the celery were gone, but the jicama was still left, but nobody knew what it was. And so after my lecture, I explained, I said, that's the white sticks out there next to the carrot. And man, every single person ate
delicious, guys. You should try.
I know, that was so fun. Like, so even catering was like, combo. We heard you're part of your lecture, and like we've run out. Like, yeah, it's food.
Yeah.
It's food is medicine.
Yeah, it really, really can play a big role, as well as like fermented foods to go, you know what I mean? Any kind of.
Yeah, if you can, but yeah.
Yeah, if you can tolerate ferments, or if you're taking a probiotic, like a big mistake people make, in my opinion, is not enough people eat enough prebiotic foods. Mm-hmm. So on a regular basis, at least. So, making sure you're getting like your garlic and your onion and your bananas, all of that. Like we were saying, jicama, Jerusalem artichoke. So I don't know that many people eating Jerusalem artichoke every day. So you can get it in. If you're not taking prebiotics, which they're the food for that probiotic, that good bacteria, your probiotics really aren't going to stand much of a chance of like thriving in the gut. So I usually like to pair those, especially for people who have really impaired diversity in the gut, is really giving it like a fair shot, giving it some food. So yeah, the probiotics along with prebiotics, and especially if you, like you mentioned earlier, if you get thrown on antibiotics, right, you can't always avoid them. There's a time for them, especially people who have I have been there, gone through multiple rounds of like Lyme treatment. Your gut is a total mess, right? And so if you're on that, you need to be working with someone really on gut health, or the immune system, everything, hormones connected all down. It's going to get all messed up. It's going to go right.
It's so true. Even between antibiotics and stress, as you talk about and have lectured about, we have this mucus layer. We have this mucus layer, right, in our intestines, and it's this nice little buffer so that we don't run right up against our intestinal wall. We want the mucus layer to trap things and, catch things so we don't get irritation. Well, one of the big things that like wears down the mucus layer is this chronic ongoing stress. And who's had chronic ongoing stress the last year? I know, right? Raise your hand.
Hasn't. Oh my God.
And unfortunately, you have too, people say, I thought I had my gut under control. I thought my gas, my bloating, my constipation, my indigestion, I thought it was better in 2019. And now towards the end of 2020 into 2021, I must be back. I must have SIBO again. I must have this. I must have that, and I'm like, maybe, but it could also be that you've been under tremendous amount of stress, and cortisol is a big wearer downer of that mucus layer. And it's irritating to the intestines. They don't want their mucus layer to be, they need the buffer. And it also affects the little junctions, the tight junctions, which we talk about in our intestinal cells, our little gatekeepers that allow things to cross through, or not if they're not supposed to. And cortisol, along with bacteria and infections and inflammation, are also things that can affect those little gatekeepers. And now things are sliding through your gate. So picture like a broken gate headed into your backyard, right? Like you don't want creepy people and bad people and, scary dogs heading into your backyard. Like that's not appropriate. And so we have to close the gate, and that can be really helpful. So even just being mindful and, working on our stress reduction and getting good sleep and, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. People joke about self-care, like, yeah, who has time for that? I'm like, I know, but at the same time, who doesn't? Like we have to make it a priority.
I know.
Even if it's just 10 or 15 minutes, so you can work just a little bit of mindfulness. can set the day and really help and, really affect your resiliency and
Yeah,
ultimately.
I think I always loved that. I'm going to say analogy. It's not really an analogy, but like when a provider will ask a patient, right, who has a lot of GI complaints and stress, when you go on vacation, how do you feel? Right?
Yes.
And if you're the person who's like, well, I'm fine, like, you know what I mean? I'm eating foods and drinks I would never have, and everything's great. Like that is the cortisol, that is the stomach acid, that is the stress versus I have SIBO, I have this, I have this. Like, yes, you may have both. It is a potential. But if you're someone like, if you go on vacation, you still feel like crap, there's an issue, right? There's an infection, there's some kind of imbalance going on, digestive output issue. But I do always like that concept of like, okay, when the weekend comes, do you feel better? Do you know what I mean? Like, then we need to dive deeper into, okay, maybe there is a cortisol hormone component, right? There is some way you're not managing your stress, which is really hard to do, right? It's like easier to lecture on than do.
100%. Even for those of us who lecture on it.
I know
Know all the tricks.
Cortisol is one of those, in my opinion, right? There's phases of cortisol shifts for people and it being high, low, and people love to like fixate and be like, I definitely have high cortisol, but it's really hard, right? It's fluctuating, first of all, and it's dipping at certain points. This is why I love the Dutch test. And Dutch does offer just an adrenal test I like the combination, but for people like who are on, OCPs and birth control, it's a good option. But if you can have very mimicking symptoms, right? Or as it's transitioning in that stressful time period, like it can also go from you are actually producing a lot till you crapped out and you're producing not much.
Not much.
I don't know if you have an opinion on that at all. But.
Well, earlier we were saying that, which I love, test, don't guess, because so many things can overlap, so many symptoms, and they can mimic each other. And the first thing I thought of is cortisol, because seeing thousands of tests working at Dutch, thousands and thousands and thousands, I will have providers who will call and say, her cortisol's normal, but she's so tired.
Yeah.
What's wrong? I'm like, well, cortisol's not the only hormone that has to do with fatigue. Like, it's just one of the 20. So it must be something else.
Yeah.
Or the opposite, like, oh my gosh, my patient has anxiety and they have insomnia, but their cortisol is low. That's not possible. I'm like, well, cortisol is just one of the hormones. This is why testing is important. Cortisol is not contributing to these things. It's something else, and we have to dig deeper.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, what will happen is, just like you said with estrogen or microbiome, people will treat cortisol in the same. They will take these online quizzes. They will determine that their cortisol is low on a quiz. They will take all this stimulatory stuff and they will feel worse. And they're like, why do I feel worse? And said, well, you probably weren't low. You might have been actually high with other imbalances. And now you've just made a high cortisol higher and made yourself worse. It's entirely possible.
I know. I had somebody recently reach out on some post I did on adaptogens, and they were like, they don't work for me. I was like, maybe you don't have a cortisol issue. Like, maybe this is a different issue. This is why testing is so important, right? Because everything overlaps. And I think something really important. So, right, we have this like triad within the body of sex hormones, adrenal hormones, and thyroid hormones, and they all have to be playing fairly or they're going to be playing unfairly together, right? So, and it's a really, really delicate balance, which is why we keep reiterating in this podcast, like test and don't guess and work with a provider, which I know it's hard to find the right providers, but it's kind of like do your research and stuff on people.
Or just see Katie.
just see me. I also do, I have been using Dutch tests, I feel like before it even became like super popular on things, but I still go out of my way to make a consult with a Dutch provider for every single patient that does a Dutch consult, because you guys are the experts, you know what I mean? Like gut testing, I can literally do in my sleep. It takes me 1 second, but with that, I'm like, I don't want to miss anything. This is so delicate and crazy hard to understand as a human being. So I do go out of my way to always make sure that Dutch is a part of it. But with this, like how, right, we're fixating on the estrobolome, and the estrogen balance and how that relates to the gut. But if you mess with estrogen, right, every hormone, it's like a teeter-totter. Like everything is going to be moving the other hormone. They're all going to interact. So if you push estrogen, you might be moving testosterone or vice versa. So I think that is something that maybe you can put a little light on to people, like the imbalances they may cause. And I don't know where I was just doing my research on the testobolome is becoming, and I don't know if it's now a real thing, but I'm talking a thing in like, PubMed, this is coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
So not just like functional medicine world, but so, right, there's a whole now connection being made with testosterone within the gut. So maybe
Even
you
DHEA, if you think about it, DHEA is sulfated. There's an S put on. So, I mean, a lot of people maybe have had their DHEA S run. So in the gut, if you have a high enzyme called STS, then STS takes the S off. So one, it can take so estrogen can also be sulfated. You can have estrone S, estradiol S. And so if you have high levels of STS in your gut, now you've taken the S off and that hormone is now active and recirculates. So DHEA S is now DHEA and gets pulled back into circulation. Estrone, which is one of your estrogens, can now get back into circulation. And so we talk about the estrobolome and beta-glucuronidase, which is specific for hormones that have gone through glucuronidation, but you also have hormones that go through sulfation, and those hormones can also be affected by the microbiome. So it just goes to show that it's inherently a smart system. Like your body was designed with lots of checks and balances and to keep you in balance and, to try to help you. And the gut isn't trying to work against you. It was originally designed and trying to set up so that you could have healthy levels of hormones when you need them and as you need them. And then at the same time, absorb your nutrients and absorb your vitamins and, go about your way and get rid of toxins. But unfortunately, I think just with time and like lifestyle stuff and stress, and it just compounds on it. And now the whole system becomes imbalanced. And so, yes, really, they should call it the hormonalome, which is the hormone microbiome, because all of the hormones are affected, all of them.
I feel like, I know the research is just beginning with all of this between hormones, gut health for sure. We are just like skimming the surface here, and it's changing all of the time. So I'm pretty excited to see about that. And like with this, so right, best picture to figure out there's a lot you can do, but the best way to approach, in my opinion, figuring out what is going on with your hormones is, right, find a provider, work with me, something like that, where you can get a comprehensive stool test, an evaluation on your lifestyle and diet, right, because that's a huge component, as well as a Dutch test, and hopefully a full thyroid panel, because a huge one on this is, right, constipation is huge for 1,000 reasons. I post about this all the time if you need to dive into it. And I have an ebook all about how to get rid of your IBS, which we dive a lot into constipation. So, but with that, if things are just sitting there, even due to a subclinical hypothyroid situation, that bacteria is just going to have a feeding frenzy, grow, which is going to increase your beta-glucuronidase, which is then going to increase your circulating hormones, right? So you're going to get the estrogen dominance, you're going to feel lousy, and you're going to probably, as a female, fixate on the hormone part.
Right.
Right. We could deal with the constipation. We could deal with this. We could take magnesium citrate and kind of like mask it. But if you aren't fixing the underlying cause, we're going to put an S on that, which could be the hormones, the stress, the diet, the thyroid, all of it, you're not going to get to the root cause. So it gets very complicated.
And not only that, if you have a thyroid issue, it's not just estrogen. Like you were saying earlier, right? Hormones don't work in a silo. It's the ovaries don't hang out by themselves and not talk to anybody. And so if you do have hypothyroidism, it could absolutely affect your ability to ovulate, which could affect your ability to make progesterone. And now you have a progesterone issue, right? And it just sort of really compounds on itself.
I find it really interesting, the more maybe just age range I'm getting in with all my friends in their 30s, married and having kids and stuff. But I haven't quite been there where you're having to go to a fertility clinic and all of that, but I've never heard any of my friends that have had to go through IVF or any kind of fertility clinic that they ever talk about their gut health.
I know that's a really good point. It actually, sort of hormones in general, because I find with IVF, it's very controlled. So for those of your listeners who've gone through IVF, they're probably nodding their head like, oh my gosh, yes, it's very regimented. You follow their schedule. You're on their medications or injections. You go on this day, right? And I've had reproductive endocrinologists say to me in not so many words of like, well, we really don't care what their hormones are doing and everything else is doing, because it's like they go on Clomid, then they get this shot, and then and then we retrieve, and then we ultrasound, then we retrieve. And so it's so structured that they're like, we don't really care what are those other like estrogen, progesterone's doing, because we control it all. So we can even give them a shot to get them to ovulate if we see that they're close but not quite. And it's just mind blowing to me. And so for those who are listening who are not quite ready for IVF, or maybe you've been told you need IVF, but you're hoping there's some sort of gray area. There's totally a gray area, and I think that's what's missing. It's either it's like try IUI and Clomid, which IUI is intrauterine insemination that can be done in the office. And if that doesn't work, then it jumps right to IVF. But even with Clomid, I find a lot of the time they're still not working up much other than maybe a TSH and,
they don't even
other
do
markers.
Panel unless there's some history of like autoimmune thyroid.
Yeah.
Run
and so
I would love to do, if you're ever interested, coming on doing a whole fertility podcast. I did one with Christine Marin, which was amazing. It was more on detox and fertility. Yeah, she's wonderful. This has really been like a power year for women on coming on to GHD.
I love it.
I'm like loving just the more I'm into this space, I guess, in my own personal life. Like I just feel like there's so much more information that we could get to women of childbearing age that they do get stuck around the ages of like 28 to 34, where they feel like they have to dive into IVF and it becomes very panicky, and which is not a way to have fertility go right. And the chronic stress and gut health. But I just feel like there's a lot of that gray area is not discussed.
And IVF can be really expensive, right? So if you don't have insurance or you don't you're not prepared or have set aside savings for this, it's, when you're looking at 20, 30 plus grand, depending on how you do it and what you do, and it doesn't work. I mean, that's one, it's devastating. And two, it's devastating because, and I'm sure you have too, I would get women post IVF come to me that said, I can't afford round 2 quite yet. We're saving. What can I do in the meantime? And lo and behold, we find all the stuff that they could have done before round 1. And that's devastating because they're like, are you friggin' kidding me? These are things I maybe could have helped my chances the first go round, and I could maybe be pregnant right now. I'm like, well, I don't know, but maybe.
Just the messenger on this part.
I know.
But it's true, right? Like how many women have gone through, we're sort of digressing, but like how many women have gone through all this and then in their 30s, even in their 40s, now they're learning, I could have had a full thyroid panel. I could have had my gut worked up. I could have had a Dutch test. You know what I mean? Outside of the basic traditional healthcare that's offered. And it's like, yes, there is a time and a place for IVF. There is a time. There are many people that, of course, get great help and beautiful babies out of it. But there is so much that you can do. And people don't know what that is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the women in couples who decide not to go through IVF because they absolutely can't afford it. And then they just stop. And I'm like, oh, that breaks my heart because and they never got any workup. My point is they maybe went with their gynecologist, maybe they got Clomid, some IUI, that didn't work. They can't afford IVF. They've decided to stop, or keep trying, you know what I'm saying? Keep trying, but not continue with IVF but then nothing's done in between, their OBGYN's just like, well, best of luck. I'm like, no, not best of luck.
The hormone balance is just a mess too.
We can help. It's the same with I was saying this on another podcast, but it goes with gut health. A mentor of mine years ago, she said, if you have a bad enough infection going on in the gut, it's only one thing can grow down there. So if the infection is raging in your GI tract, or even in your stomach, if you've got ulcers or even whatever, she's like, that's going to win out. And you're going to really, you're not viewed as safe enough or healthy enough in a sense to implant and grow a baby. So she said, you absolutely have to clean up the gut first. And then that allows, because the uterus and the gut are right next to each other, they're basically neighbors. And so she was saying it's so important to clean up the gut when you look into becoming pregnant. And then my miscarriage story is traditionally women are allowed 3 miscarriages before they get worked up. And that is the most asinine thing I've ever heard, because I'm like, one is devastating, not to keep using that word, but it's, like devastating. And then they're like, all right, well, if you have 2 more, then we'll work you up. I'm like, what? Who came up with that stupid rule? Like, just work them up now.
Probably a man who didn't go through that, who didn't unfortunately have to go through the loss.
Exactly.
That's and also just the concept of this is where it all interlocks, is that stress hormone gut component of there's so much stress just around people are perceiving they have fertility issues, right? It's just not happening after a year, even if you're still young enough, right? Like, and I'm talking like a lot of people that are approaching 30 are still, they're stressed. They're like, it's not happening. And I'm like, you're still so young. There's still so much that can happen. Don't you worry. But, with that, right, when you're chronically stressed, which trying to conceive in that state to me is chronically stressful for people, your reproductive abilities are not necessary. They will shut down, right? You will shut down your hormonal components. You will shut down your gut health because all you have is that blood flow seeing fight or flight. Can't differentiate between a tiger trying to maul my face off and me trying to conceive with my husband. And your gut and your hormones will start to lessen, and that energy is going to go elsewhere to your extremities so you can flee. So it is truly like a constant thing. We cannot change perception of stress, physical stress, any of it. So if fertility and trying to conceive is stressful to you all of the time, or going through IVF, like and then of course you can't be like, don't be stressed, calm down, try
because that works on a woman trying to become pregnant.
That'll work on a woman trying to get pregnant. But it's so true, and it's something people don't talk about, is like the stress is so detrimental to every other organ and system, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, it's true. Just fertility in general is like this hush hush. It's becoming less so taboo, but fertility in general, a lot of women don't want to talk about their fertility struggles. They're embarrassed about their fertility struggles. They're disappointed that they weren't pregnant the first month, the second month, or third month, especially if like their sister-in-law got pregnant right away, their best friend got pregnant right away. All these, stupid women on Instagram are getting pregnant right away. And so it can be really, really hard. And I kept having these conversations with my women of like, no, look, here are the % chance you have of every month, and here are the things we're going to do to try to optimize this as best as possible. And there's so much in the gray area, and we're gonna make it right.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dutch can really, I believe, can help quite a lot with fertility issues. So if you are someone who's thinking about having children, get ahead of it. If you're somebody trying to actively conceive and maybe finding it harder than you had hoped, definitely get a Dutch test. And if you're even somebody who's like done rounds of IVF and you just want to see if there's maybe something else you can do, like this is often a different form of testing than you are getting elsewhere. So
same with the gut testing, right? Same with the GI. Like if you do have a raging infection, then that's going to win out over implantation.
Absolutely. I like that. Raging infection. It's true. It's sadly true. But this has been wonderful. Do you have any questions for me or anything you want to tell our listeners here?
I was like, oh my gosh, we could probably go on.
I could go on for hours and
hours. I guess the biggest thing I would say for, men and women, but women tend to listen to their bodies more, is to listen to your body, and I have one of my biggest pet peeves, yours too, is when women get blown off as like, oh, you're just, even we've talked about stress for sure. Like, oh, you're just stressed, or you're just tired, or you're just, it's just the pandemic. And you know what? It just might be, but then offer help, offer solutions, do testing, like let's go that next step. And women live in their bodies 24/7, 365. So if you feel something is off, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. So if you go to a doctor or a provider or somebody who blows you off, time to find a new one. I'm sorry to say, but it's time to find a new one who's going to listen to you. And even in conventional medicine, like I have an OBGYN that I absolutely love. I get her for 10 minutes, 15 tops, but she's wonderful. And she doesn't do functional or naturopathic medicine, which I am, but she fully supports me. And, like we have these great conversations. And when I've got questions, she's like right there. But if she didn't, I've been to other doctors who've just completely sort of shut me down or blown me off. And I'm like, no, look, this is my field. I know what I'm talking about.
Like, for them, they're like, I remember back in the day, they're like, just take the birth control. And I was like, I think that this can influence the gut. Like this was like early on tonight, and they were just like, no. Like when I was like, I can't, okay, we're done here.
Yeah.
I had to like send over like my uncle connection that at the time where I lived, where he was like a big IFM person, and just explaining. That's when they started to listen. I was like, oh my gosh, we can't even open the ears of these people
at all. So that's why I tell women, like, if you think something is off, you are right, and keep searching and keep seeking help, and see Katie. Because she'll listen.
And where can our followers and listeners today find you and follow you so that they can get the wealth of information that you are?
I hang out on Instagram. That's where I hang out. I'm at dr.carriejones. That's where I go. I love it.
hang out on Instagram.
Hang out on
I
Instagram.
share lots of her things. You can find her through me, and you can follow us if you are not at Gut Honest Truth on Instagram, and obviously subscribe to our podcast, which I will probably put this out today because I'm eager.
I love it.
I'm ready. I've been waiting,
girl.
guys. You don't understand, for like 3 years of this podcast to I was waiting till I was just like in the right place to ask you. I was like, I'm not ready, but it's gonna be great. People are gonna eat this up because gut health and hormone health are everything, and
They
you are the queen, as you know. So thank you for being on here, and I can't wait to share with all of your followers.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.